Okay, attachment. Let's do it. Okay, so prepping for attachment in 2025 exams. We have attachment on the screen just here. A bit of a Marmite topic, I think. Yeah, I mean, you either love or hate attachment. There isn't really much middle ground. Now, for 2025, there are no clear, obvious things that are going to come up. Everything has come up within the last 2 years, so there's no obvious candidate. There have been 16 markers in attachment for the last 3 years. So I think, whilst it's perfectly plausible that a 16 marker will come up in attachment, I think there are other more likely topics that it is going to come up. Would I be surprised if a 16 marker comes up in, say, animal research? Not at all. I would be surprised, though, if I would just want to have a look at this. If a 16 marker came up in maternal deprivation, because there have been two 16 markers on this bullet point in the last 2 years. So whilst it's possible, I think it's very unlikely you're going to get a 16 marker in attachment, though you are probably going to get some other questions on it. The other thing to note here is that, and this is quite strange, in the last 3 years, there has not been a single research methods question on attachment or in attachment at all. So coupling the fact that there's been 16 markers and no research methods, and the fact that you are guaranteed to get research methods, I think somewhere between 1 and 10 marks are going to be research methods based. That's not to say don't revise attachment by any stretch of the imagination, but yeah, I mean that is a pretty specific prediction when I said I wasn't going to do it, but that's something worth noting, really. Now I've got the spec up here. One thing to note with attachment is that it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 named pieces of research. So you're going in, and of which you need to know all of them. Schaffer is a piece of research, but it's the stages that are named by Schaffer. So you're probably not going to get a question specifically on Schaffer and Emerson. Probably not. Lorenz and Harlow, you could get a question. Bowlby's monotropic theory is not so much a piece of research as it is a theory, so you could get a question on that theory. I want to just note something here. If you have a look at what actually comes up, you're being asked about Ainsworth's... Well, what comes up in the spec is Ainsworth's strain situation, not her pieces of research. So whilst it's useful to know Ainsworth's findings, 70% secure, 15 and 15% insecure, you're not likely going to get asked a question. What you're far more likely going to be asked is about the procedure that she created called the strange situation. And you may have to evaluate that procedure, not her findings. That's really important, by the way. The other thing is just having a look at this bullet point in general. So I do worry about students knowing the difference between Ainsworth and Van Eysendorn. Ainsworth created the strange situation. Van Eysendorn collected pieces of research that used the strange situation. And more on Van Eysendorn in a second, actually. I'm less worried about this bullet point just here. Maternal deprivation, Romanian studies. There was a 16 marker on Romanian studies. Effects of institutionalization. That has come up as 16 markers in the last 2 years, but students aren't strong at this. Students are not strong at maternal deprivation. They get really confused about Romanian orphans. You need to know more than Rutter's ERA, English and Romanian adoptee study. So students aren't particularly good on that. But the worst bit of attachment by a country mile is this one just here. It confuses students. The influence of early attachment, so how you were raised, on both your childhood and adulthood relationships. So basically, is there a correlation between how you were raised, i.e. secure, avoidant, resistant, and the quality of your childhood and adulthood relationships? Now for this, my strong advice would be, I've got my slides up just here. Again, there's other YouTubes on this. I'm not going to spend this video going through this. I'm just pointing out that it is a major thing to be aware of. But you need to know internal working model and the continuity hypothesis for this. And you need to know the differences between those. Internal working model is this template that is based upon our primary attachment, and we use that template to form other attachments. So if you are secure with your primary caregiver, let's say your mum, if you're secure with your mum, you will think that's normal, and then you will build relationships using that template. But if you've got a resistant attachment, your mum is super clingy, has trust issues, is quite unstable with her love, for example, you're going to think that's normal, and thus you're going to take that template and build that onto all your childhood and adult relationships. So that's what we call the internal working model. The continuity hypothesis is this idea that there's a few variations of it, but it's this idea about our attachments continue into adulthood. So a securely attached individual will have significantly different relationships in adulthood than those who are resistant or attachment. So there is a continuity between how you're raised and adult relationships. Now, personally, I really buy the internal working model. I think it explains it really well. To be quite frank, those of you who are resistant with everybody, because that's your template, that's your style, that's your way of attaching onto people. So I really believe in the internal working model. I'm not a big fan of the continuity hypothesis, and I know my thoughts don't matter on here, but continuity hypothesis says that your relationships and style doesn't really change from childhood to adulthood. I think that's crap. I think that's rubbish, personally. Now, on this, you need to know at least one piece of research for childhood relationships. This is the question I really worry about, by the way. I reckon if they asked a question on this, what's going to be quite important is whether that says childhood or adulthood. And I think that's missed by most students. So if they ask you about childhood, early attachments on childhood relationships, you want to talk about Kearns and Myron Wilson Smith. Now, I'm not going to spend too long on this. Again, there's another video on this, so if you want to pause this video and write it down or go to the original video, then I recommend you do this. But this is relationships in later childhood, going through school. How have you been raised, and how does that reflect in your childhood attachments? You also need to know about how your early attachment affects your love life nowadays. And the best one for this is Hazan and Shaver. However, Hazan and Shaver are just one example you can go for, and you want to diversify your pieces of research. Do not just have Hazan and Shaver. So I've got a couple of other ones here. There's a brief one on the screen here. I'm not going to spend too long, but this is Bailey looking at attachments in adulthood. And you've also got a really recent piece of research here from Dale, only 6 years ago, that found that the warmth of the caregiver at birth was positively correlated to a high secure adult attachment score, right? And same with insecure. So know those pieces of research. That's this is going to be if an 8 marker comes up in this, most people don't do well in that 8 marker. The other one, just to give you a bit of a heads up really, is be careful of just knowing Van Eisendorn for cultural variations. What happens if they ask you a 16 marker? Simply discuss research into cultural variations. Most of you only know Van Eisendorn. That's not enough. You're going to need some other pieces of research. Now, Van Eisendorn is useful here, but if you only keep banging on and wanging on about Van Eisendorn, the examiner is very quickly going to think you are a one-trick pony. You only know Van Eisendorn. So there's a couple of other small pieces of research you may need to know. Takahashi is a very good one. It's short, it's sharp, it's about Japanese kids and how different Japanese kids are raised. And there's the findings just here on the screen, which again, I'm not going to spend too long on because you can look at this yourself. Takahashi is one way you could go down. Another way you can go down is Simonelli and Italians. Now, I have had, I love Italian people. I think they're beautiful people. But I have been quite close for the last few years with an Italian family who are remarkably resistant. Now, are all Italian families resistant, insecure resistant? No, they're not. But generally speaking, it is a norm. It is a norm because of Italian culture, long working hours, multiple jobs people have in Italy. That's part of the culture, to have multiple jobs a lot of the time. You're not there as much as secure relationships in the USA would be, for example. So what they found is there's quite a big mix of both avoidant and resistant attachments in Italian culture, suggesting there are variations in cultural child rearing. Different countries bring up their kids differently. Now remember, big evaluation here. I'm going on way longer than I intended. Big evaluation here is that this is all very skewed towards the Western idea of how to raise kids. It literally says secure. It literally says secure. And that's the good one, according to Mary Ainsworth, the American. In Italy, it is perfectly normal. It is perfectly normal and not wrong at all to have a bit of distance from your kid. In sort of Western countries, in Italian is Western, but in Britain, in Sweden, in America, we sort of go, right? That is cultural bias that we have in doing that. But anyway, Simonelli, Takahashi, Van Eisendorn, good pieces of research to know. Now, lastly, or not almost lastly, I would expect AO2 in your exam. AO2 is a really easy option for any bullet point in attachment, and they do like to hit with attachments quite a lot. The other thing is be aware of this role of the father. It is coming out of the specification next year, but not for you guys. I would know at least 3 pieces of research for role of the father. Just small pieces of research. Frody, Geiger, Lamb, Belsky, Brown, Hurdy. Right? Know 3 of those 6 for role of the father. And a reminder that if they ask you discuss research into caregiver infant interactions, role of the father does come under caregiver infant interactions. I think that's it. No obvious ones coming up, to be perfectly frank with you. Attachment does need revising, particularly bullet points. 4, 5 and 6 in particular are usually students' weakest. Last thing, learning theory. Please don't talk about Pavlov or Skinner. Pavlov and Skinner were not attached to their rats or their dogs, right? Case in point, Pavlov shoved tubes into his dog's salivary glands. That's not indicative of an attachment most of the time. You don't do that. I don't do that to my kid. So don't talk about Pavlov or Skinner. They are irrelevant to attachment. You want to talk about Dollard and Miller. See slides. Dollard and Miller. Good luck with attachment. It is not the easiest.